Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, where both of our speakers make welcome returns at the Sydney Institute. As you know, the topic is Australian politics in the lead up to the election, two views, and we have with us Peter Van Onselen, who's going to lead off, who's the political editor of the Daily Mail Australia and also the author of a number of books, and Gemma Tognini, who is the Executive Director of GT Communications. She's also a weekly columnist for The Australian and a Sky News contributor. So we start off with Peter.
Thanks very much, Gerard, and Anne as well, and thanks very much for everyone being here. I'll speak for about 15 minutes and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A afterwards, because I'm sure you've got lots of thoughts and comments that you want to offer on the way through. I'm always a little nervous when I speak in front of Gerard, because I try to often refer to, facts around numbers and seats and redistributions and positions around things, and I get particularly nervous when I start to do historical comparisons, because Gerard seems to know everything that I don't. So I'll see how I go. He might be good enough tonight to point it out to me privately afterwards rather than in front of you all. We'll see. I will make a sort of prediction for the next election as part of explaining where I think the election is likely to go. I know both sides of politics would probably rather I didn't predict that they're going to win based on my track record. So that's bad news for Anthony Albanese, because I think that if I had to pick, my prediction would be that he gets home, but in a very ugly win, and wins as probably a minority government, and possibly even, if this is even the right way to put it, a very minority government, not like 2010, for example, where they cobbled it together with a number in the 70s. They could even be in the high 60s and try to cobble those numbers together. And I'll talk a little bit about how I think that complexion might look in the aftermath of that sort of election result, because I don't think it's anywhere near comparable to the way that things will play out to what happened in 2010, partly because of the way things played out in the aftermath of 2010, particularly for those rural independents that ended up suffering for their decision to support the Julia Gillard government. But I don't say that prediction about Anthony Albanese being returned with any confidence, just to be clear, because the times that we live in are so uncertain, and the domestic factors at play around the economy all seem to be working against the government, both in terms of their response. I hope that's not elbow ringing to complain about what I'm saying, but I think it's working against the government, and the timing of the election I think becomes really important. I think Anthony Albanese would have a better chance of being re-elected if he called an early election this year, but I think every instinct in his body will be to nervously push it back to next year, because he's worried that he won't win well enough if he goes this year. That feels reminiscent to me of what Kevin Rudd did, and when he made the mistake of not calling the double dissolution after what happened with the ETS, he didn't even make it to the subsequent election, and then of course replaced Labor, still went on to only win as a minority government the following year. Anthony Albanese, I think, wants to go early, but only if he thinks he can win well. And one of the problems that this Labor government's got, which makes it so different to past change of government elections, is their majority is just wafer thin. Notwithstanding picking up Aston at the by-election, they've still only got 78 seats. And then when you look at the redistributions, they've lost Higgins. They were probably going to lose that anyway at the election, but that seat is now gone, and there's only 150 seats that will be there in the lower house at the next election, rather than 151. The seat of North Sydney in New South Wales is also getting abolished. I was always led to believe that was one of the ones that the Liberal Party thought they were better placed to pick up off the Teals than not, but whether that was the case or not, that seat is now gone. And there's the extra seat in Western Australia, which, yes, it's notionally a Labor seat, but that's based on the Mark McGowan results of 2022, rather than what's likely to happen, I think, at the next election. So I certainly know Liberals in the West think that that's a seat that they not only should, but will pick up, all things being equal. So it's a difficult complexion for Labor to do anything other, in my view, than win badly if they're going to win at all. Now, history is on their side in terms of being able to scrape home, because, and I've said this plenty of times before, but no first-term opposition has managed to win its way back into government since 1931. At that time, the Labor Party split. We're in the midst of the Great Depression. Things aren't quite that bad yet, but nonetheless, they were pretty unique circumstances. But that history does sit there regularly looking like it's going to be broken, because even Howard's 1998 re-election, he got back with less than 50% of the two-party vote, less than 49% of the two-party vote, but he picked it up by sandbagging the key seats and actually having a relatively healthy majority. But he had a very healthy majority to start with in 96, which of course is the whole point. When you look at Anthony Albanese's majority, it's nothing like what John Howard's was in 1996. So they start from a very difficult position. But then even what happened after that with the re-election of the coalition, I'll go to Labor next. Labor did get back, but only just in 2010. So yes, that historical reality stood firm from no first-term opposition winning their way back into government since 1931. That happened again in 2010, but only just. Labor got back after changing prime ministers with an ugly win in minority government. And even Malcolm Turnbull in 2016, when the Liberal Party the coalition tried to get back after just one term, they also made the mistake of changing leaders, but in doing, egged on by the media, I should say, but nonetheless, a mistake at the time in a lot of people's eyes and a mistake in hindsight in mine. In 2016, they still won badly. They got a wafer-thin majority, and that was the end of Malcolm Turnbull's ongoing leadership before it had really properly started in the aftermath of winning an election. So the point about raising those results is that, yes, it's been a very long time, nearly 100 years, since a first-term government has managed to lose its first attempt at re-election, but recent first-term governments have come close. So the issue at this election is this that moment where history no longer repeats itself and they come close but don't quite get there, or is this a change moment? And a lot of things add up to it being a change moment, even though I'm not predicting that it does quite go that way. Anthony Albanese is not a very good Prime Minister. He's a lot worse than I thought he would be, and he seems to be caught between what to do on all manner of issues and how to present himself. And for someone who I think at different points in his career had a deep authenticity to him, I don't think he has it as Prime Minister. And Prime Ministers often change, but I think he has really, sort of lowered himself into the role, would be the way that I would put it. And he doesn't have the support structures around him to help pull himself out of that, I don't think. I don't think Jim Chalmers has done a great job on the economy, and I like that as a starting point, Anthony Albanese said that he wanted to run a Hawke-style cabinet where he had consensus and where he liked the idea of letting ministers do their own thing. But that only works when you have a Hawke-calibre cabinet. And the problem with this cabinet is it doesn't measure up to the Hawke cabinet. And because it doesn't measure up to them, when you have a Prime Minister who isn't measuring up to his own job, not even overseen as closely as other Prime Ministers might have, I'm thinking Kevin Rudd for a start, that becomes another problem on top of a problem, okay? So it's come to my realisation as I look at this government, I used to think that the ministers that were stuck in the quagmire of the leadership showdowns going back and forth between Rudd and Gillard were very good ministers who were unlucky to be part of a dysfunctional government that had they been given a better chance, they would have administered themselves better in their portfolio roles. I'm less certain about that now. I now feel like they're just the leftover second 11 from those Rudd-Gillard years who are not actually elevating in the way that I hoped they would. Now, let me be clear, I've been very critical for years of the coalition because I, in a sense, expected more of them and they always underwhelmed in my view around things like tax reform and many other reforms that build off tax reform. Industrial relations is a theatre that they've largely completely deserted themselves from out of fear ever since the Work Choices election that John Howard lost in 2007. The interesting thing about Peter Dutton is he is a conviction politician, but the difficulty that he's got is connecting with voters. And Peter Dutton is somebody that if you meet him one-on-one is very personable, very likeable, very down-to-earth, very frank, but he has a persona that is difficult for him to move past. And the question mark for me is whether he can do what he's so successfully done in his Queensland marginal seat that he has held against the odds time and time again, where he can get around the electorate and get better known for who he really is. I don't know if he can do that in the time that he has ahead of the next election writ large across the nation. But we'll see, because he could well present a really interesting contrast in things like the election debates when he's fronting up against Anthony Albanese, who, as I say, is starting to reveal what was his strength within the Labor Party as a weakness with the electorate. He's the insider guy. For all the chaos of Rudd and Gillard as manager of government business, leader of the House, I should say, he did well at holding the ship together in terms of the Parliament. But the politics of politics is what he's all about. He's not that interested in the policies. Peter Dutton is interested in the policies, and he does it through a conviction lens. Sometimes I would argue a little too ideological, but he believes in what he does. And his nuclear policy is a very good example of that is potentially catastrophic politically for him at the next election. And I'll be fascinated to see which way this goes. I'm entirely energy agnostic. I wouldn't claim to have the first clue about the viability or otherwise of nuclear power in this country. I find memes about three-eyed fish ridiculous. I always thought that as the coalition was preparing to roll out its nuclear policy, that they would be deeply susceptible to a successful scare campaign. We've got examples, again, drawing on history, where big target opposition policies don't work, much less when you double them up with being a first-term opposition leader potentially. Because we know that it's hard for first-term oppositions, as I've already spoken about, but we also know that big target policy agendas in opposition are very difficult because oppositions don't have the access to the public service that the government obviously has. They don't always have the media rooting for them. They're usually rooting against them. And in the case of a first-term opposition, they've got history against them rather than on their side. We saw what happened to Bill Shorten with his big target agenda. It was also Bill Shorten, to be fair, so that was a double-up effect. We saw what happened to John Hewson with his big target agenda in '93. It was also John Hewson, to be fair. So is Peter Dutton going to fall into the same trap with his nuclear policy? I don't know, because, and Gemma will talk probably more about the nature of this in terms of where politics is at today, in terms of voters and how the reactions are going to be had by the electorate to a policy that is, let's face it, half-baked, but can't be anything but half-baked until you get access to government. Do voters forgive that in a leader like Peter Dutton when they're craving somebody who believes in something? Or do old-fashioned scare campaigns against big target opposition policies ultimately work, especially when they're in a first term? And the only thing I'd say that's almost counterintuitive, the idea that two negatives can make a positive, first term oppositions don't tend to win, big target opposition agendas don't tend to win. It is very unusual to bring them into the first term and have a big target agenda like Peter Dutton has done. Does that perhaps provide some sort of strong contrast to the government that decides voters to do what they also rarely do and admit that they might have made a mistake when they kicked the last government out and brought the new government in? Does the fact that Scott Morrison is no longer there give them the excuse to believe that they didn't make a mistake but they got it right just to get rid of him, so now we're going to bring this new conviction leader of the Liberal Party in instead? These are all interesting questions for me. Before I run out of time, a quick thought on the Senate. The Greens are at the maximum, well, notwithstanding Lydia Thorpe moving on, the Greens are at the maximum number of seats that they can get realistically in the Senate. They can pick up one in every state at an election, and they've now done that at 2 consecutive half-Senate elections. So they've got 12, notwithstanding that Lydia Thorpe has moved on. I'm including her in the 12. Interestingly, when you look at the Labor Party, they're sitting on 26 seats, if they hold their Senate together. The coming days will be interesting on that. They're sitting on 26, and the Greens, if you include Lydia Thorpe, have got 12. That has them falling just shy of a majority in the Senate. So it's not the rise of the Greens any further that are going to be an issue about controlling the balance of power in the Senate. They're more interesting for what may or may not happen in lower house seats, interestingly. Do they hold their 4? Do they win other ones? What role do they potentially play? If I'm right, and if Labor does scrape home and have to form minority government, how does that work with the Greens? I think those are all really interesting questions. But when it comes to the Senate, it's about whether the Labor Party can pick up more seats at the next election. They're defending their 2019 result, obviously, not their 2022 result, and that was a very poor result for them in the Senate when they lost that election. So if the Greens hold the line, as I suspect they will, it's about whether Labor can pick up an extra couple of seats to then have a scenario where they're still a long way off a majority in the Senate, but they can then govern with the support of the Greens. I don't think there's anything good about that, and I don't think there's anything good about that even pragmatically for Labor if they only need the Greens, particularly if they're then also leaning on them in the lower house to try to form minority government as well. So we're talking about what may or may not happen at the next election. If in the aftermath of it, it is a minority government, and if the Liberals, who are starting on 57 seats, notwithstanding what's happened with the redistribution, they won 58 at the last election and then lost Aston. I'm very nervous mentioning all these stats. Starting on 57, notwithstanding what happens with those redistribution changes, it's very hard for me to see them getting to a majority in their own right. And it's very hard for me to see their majority ending at a higher quantum than where Labor ends. And for that reason, I think that when you then look at the Wilkies of this world and the Greens and a few of the Teals, not all of them, not all Teals will be silly enough to throw their lot in with Labor, but some will. And some might do it eyes wide open, irrespective of what impact it might have for them at the next election. I just don't see the coalition quite getting there. But I make that prediction with a lot of nerves because we do live in really unusual times, and all the distractions might for Labor end up looking like nothing but distractions to the economy, which is all voters are going to care about. We haven't had that sort of election for a very long time in this country, not since I was formerly an adult. We haven't had an election like that where it is absolutely all about the economy as opposed to other issues in the mix as well. And we're having that now. And what impact that has on voters will be really interesting to see. What impact it has on young voters who traditionally don't, and increasingly so, don't support the coalition over the Labor Party when they're having trouble with potentially jobs, depending on where unemployment goes, but certainly with watching declining standards of living and housing accessibility and you name it. When all of that happens, do they shift from what you might call post-materialist voting and decide that, you know what, my material well-being is under siege and I just don't trust Labor to be able to manage that, even though I don't particularly like the idea of voting for someone like Peter Dutton? That will be fascinating to see. My prediction is that that doesn't quite happen, but it's a nervous prediction that's going to be held against me if I'm wrong. Thank you.
So, many thanks to Peter and Gemma Tognini. Up you go.
I'm the nervous one coming after Peter, to be honest with you. So I have been incorrect in my predictions before, so I shall make none. I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to invite you to come on a little bit of a journey with me tonight, a little bit of a game of compare and contrast. As I was thinking about the dilemma, and it is a dilemma, being asked to make a prediction about this election whenever it happens in this environment. And this environment is one, everything that can be shaken is being shaken. And I think you can apply that lens and that view to everything from the economy, our belief systems, everything that sort of forms the mundane and the meaningful of our daily lives. And I want to start with you, I want you to come back with me 2 years ago to September 2022, and I was on holiday in Italy. Lucky me. I was on holiday in Italy for the first time after COVID, seeing my family, and it just so happened that the Italian elections were on, and I'm not being trite, I actually didn't realise the elections would be on when I was there, and happy days, because I spent that week sort of semi on holiday wandering around this little Italian town on the Tuscan coast called Lerici. Now, if you know anything a little bit about the history of Italian politics, and it's a wild ride, but Tuscany is traditionally a left-leaning zona, or a left-leaning region. The Italian resistance, the far left of the Italian resistance was born in Tuscany. It's still very much centre-left and far-left today. So I'm wandering around this town called Lerici the week of the election, and I'm talking to people. I think once a columnist, always a columnist, even on holidays. And I'm asking people what they thought of the economy and what they thought of various things and how they thought things would go. And it was really, really surprising. So conversations that could easily be conversations that are happening in Australia today in this particular season, this pre-election season, whether it's this year or next. And I happen to agree with Peter's view. I think Mr Albanese is very well wedged. He doesn't want to go early because it's very risky, but the further he pushes it out, there's this conga line of manure heading to the bloke. Some of it his own making, some of it inherited, but it's all heading his direction, and he wears the hat that says Prime Minister, so everybody holds him accountable. So we all know the history. Giorgia Meloni, her Fratelli d'Italia coalition is elected. And it was so interesting to watch the pearl clutching and the hysteria from media outside of Italy. So I was doing a little bit of homework today, which is why I have notes. I never apologise for having notes because my memory's not that great. But The Atlantic in September 22 had this headline, "The Return of Fascism in Italy." Brilliant. The World Socialist website, perhaps less surprising, neo-fascist Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia wins the general election. Now, it's just hilarious. Here in Australia, I mean, one glass of Chianti and everybody's a geopolitical expert in Italian politics. People were, like, seriously, people were saying the most ridiculous things, even in, you know, very respected mastheads. And to me, being in Italy, first of all, because my father was born there and I went to school and university both in Italy, but the premier left-leaning masthead in Italia is called La Repubblica. It's a left-leaning masthead. It's probably not The Guardian, but it's probably somewhere between the Sydney Morning Herald and The Guardian. So it's, no, I mean, like, I'm trying to give an accurate, it's not that far left, but it's, you know, it's on the way. Anyway, the point of raising that is, this is an Italian publication dealing with Italian politics in its own country. It refers to Meloni as centre-right. It refers to her as centre-right. She's well established as a centre-right politician. And all of the doomsdayers who are predicting things like she's going to outlaw abortion and she's going to roll back same-sex marriage and she's going to do all of these things. Of course, none of those things happened, probably because, above all things, she's a survivor and a populist, but also none of those would have been electorally palatable. Why am I bringing all of these things to your attention? I'll tell you why. Because at the time in Italy, the things that got her elected could very well be the things that we are talking about here. Immigration. At the time in Italy, this has since been reformed, you could literally rock up on a beach in Lampedusa, walk into the country and go take a job. There was no system of immigration management. Hear me now, I'm not saying ours is perfect, but at least we have a degree of visibility over who's coming to our shores. The economy was stressed. People were doing it tough. A big part of that was the cost of energy. My cousin was telling me that, so I go in summer, she had gone away up the mountain, because that's what my people do. We're from the north of Italy, and when it gets over 30 degrees, everybody panics and heads up the mountain. So she'd gone up to her mother's place in Switzerland, left nothing but the fridge running in her house, and her power bill went up. And she's a single mother on not far off the minimum wage. So multiply that out, and that's the kind of vibe you're getting there. Social cohesion, a huge issue in Italy at the time, and cost of living, as I've mentioned. So all of those issues are being mirrored in our conversations today. If you look at what's happened in the last 2 years since Meloni has been elected, and I think this is the most interesting one, and I didn't actually realise that until today, regulated household energy prices have fallen by 20%. 20% drop in energy prices. Now, I have a cousin, this might be hard to believe, but I have a cousin who is a paid-up member of the Socialist Party. Can't believe we've got the same DNA. But it's true. And he said to me before he passed away last year, he said to me, I think she's doing a really good job, and he wasn't being sarcastic. And I think that speaks to this this thing that Peter touched on the other theme that Peter touched on at the end of his address. It's that, you know, what's in it for me, that generation who are like, well, I don't really like the coalition parties, and I'm sort of ideologically drawn to the left, but heck, I can't buy a house. And it comes down to individual agency. Many are saying at the moment that there is a march to the right across Europe, and you can certainly say that from a factual basis in elections, local and, you know, at a national level. But I would wonder, and what I want you to consider tonight, is it as much a march to the right, or is it a march away from the left? Is it a march away from governments that cannot deliver social cohesion, that don't show leadership, that it's the ultimate let them eat cake? We were talking in the office the other day about the Teals, and it's so ironic that these Teal seats are high net worth, absolute privilege in the truest sense of that phrase, and their policies are so regressive and they hurt the most vulnerable. You cannot tell me that our current energy policy, if you can even call it a policy, is going to deliver anything other than energy poverty for those who are already most vulnerable. I believe, for what it's worth, in a mix, renewables has a place. I drive a Tesla. I hate it. Anyone wants to buy it, talk to me afterwards. But it's that whole idea of, you know, the the positioning of the left as being this caring, socially responsible outfit, and the evidence just doesn't show that. And I don't think you can ever, for an elongated period of time, fool the electorate. You might be able to for one electoral cycle, maybe two. And I think the factors that I was talking about in Italy and now Australia, I mean, we look at immigration, the boats have started again. The minister is completely out of his depth. It's a complete schmozzle, an absolute debacle. Our economy, it's a difficult, highly regulated, expensive, prohibitive place to do business, this country. It just is. We have, that is an inalienable fact. Social cohesion, particularly since October 7th, and I'm not making a political statement about two states and whatnot. I just think that, morally there is a line in the sand and there is no justification for what was enacted on the 7th of October. And the Albanese government, and I would say the state government of New South Wales have not done what they should have to deal with behaviour that in any other context, and if that behaviour was being performed by any other racial or ethnic group, would have been stamped down like that. If you had a Christian minister standing up and preaching death to all, pick your cohort, that church would be shut down in 30 seconds flat. Let's not pretend that's not the case. So the social cohesion point, I think personally it might fall into that bucket of quiet Australians. And I don't think, Scott Morrison didn't own or invent the quiet Australians. It simply worked in that narrative because the polling was out and nobody expected him to win. Quiet Australia, that's just who we are. We line up. COVID showed us that we line up. We follow rules, but we will quietly seethe and smile and then vote differently in the polling booth. And of course, the cost of living. So again, these factors are not unique to Australia. You can almost look across Europe to any jurisdiction that you care to examine and see common threads. Does that mean there will be a common outcome here? I actually don't know. I'm going to jump in the same boat as Pete in terms of I wouldn't be surprised, I wouldn't be completely shocked if there was a flipping of this government. And when the Albanese government was elected, I was trite, I was like, oh, they're a bunch of one-termers. And I was just being cranky because, it's not my team. But I also said this on air, if he governs well and his government governs well and leads well, then we all thrive. And that's something that everybody wants. Nobody in their right mind goes, well, I hope he fails, because that means we all fail and the country suffers. I feel like my observation is that there's a sense that the government hasn't yet worked out it's in government. They haven't yet worked out that there are things they can do and could do. They've been so desperately, what's the word I'm looking for, distracted by things that are just, beneath the office of people who are elected to make our lives better. I'm in furious agreement with Pete on Mr. Chalmers. I think it shows that he has no real economy experience. He has no real life experience professionally outside of academia and politics, and I think that shows when you're trying to balance the books. And then talking about Peter Dutton, I'm actually Dutton agnostic, to be honest. I didn't have a firm, I didn't dislike him, I just didn't have a view on him at all. The one thing that I know from people in Canberra, and I'm very rarely in Canberra, thankfully, is that you can't get a job in his office, that there's very low churn. And as an employer, when people stay around, it means you're doing something right, particularly in a political environment. I think for me, the first time I looked at him performing, it was the moment after The Voice, and I want to talk about The Voice as an issue, but when I was watching the media conference that he did with Jacinta, I looked at him and thought, okay, there's something there that I hadn't seen before, and if Australians can see that side of him, and it was just a very, an easy, I thought heartfelt address off the cuff, and sure, it's easy when you're winning, so to speak, but it didn't, it doesn't have to be, it's not necessarily a given. So I'm actually hopeful that given time and perhaps the right strategy, that people will get to know him, and at the end of the day, I don't think there's a Scott Morrison to despise anymore, and the Labor Party haven't got that tool anymore. And particularly, I think the Teals, it will be really interesting to see. I'm in the electorate of a Teal in North Sydney, and it's just ineffective, respectfully, ineffective, absent, complete waste of space. No, that's the truth. That's my true view as a voter. So, yeah, I think. Anything could happen. Genuinely, anything could happen, and I'm not just trying to hedge here. I'd be, if I had, if I was a betting woman, and I'm not because I'm so terrible at that sort of stuff, I'd throw a sly 50 on Dutton for lols. I really would, because I think anything is possible, and we don't know what's coming. You don't know what's around the corner. These are desperately uncertain times, but I also think there comes a point where Middle Australia, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gerard, because you probably will, Australian elections have historically always been one in the centre. They always have been one in the centre. And as for that, as for the cohort, and I always think about it in the context of my niece and nephew who are in their early 20s, the challenge, and I think the challenge for the Liberal Party is that's a generation, and probably up to the age of 30, 35, that's a generation that we Conservatives have spoken at for a long time and have not considered for a long time. We haven't given them anything to conserve for a long time. I'm channeling Gray Connolly with that because I know that's his favourite thing to say. But and that's a rod that we've made for our own back. So if we can learn to engage with that generation, and I put myself in that bucket too, because sometimes I find myself shaking my fist at the sky, and I think that could, giving, my nephew said to me recently, I don't know how I'm ever going to afford a house. And why was that important? Because he's now 21 in his first post-university job, living a real life, seeing how much, like, taxation is theft, FYI, but he's seeing how much he's being taxed and looking down the future and going, I maybe need to understand these policies better than I understand them. So what is the tipping point? I think that would be my final observation. So there's always a tipping point. I'm not just talking about the book. Is the tipping point, I don't hold a hose, or, making Prince, was it Prince Philip a knight? Yeah, like that sort of stuff. Seriously, I do not know her, so I say this with absolutely no horse in the race, but the Governor-General's pay rise in this environment, is that a tipping point? Everyone I know in the last week or so has been talking about it, and that's not even people in the political sense or a media sense. It's like, mate, everyone I know is on a budget. Every business I know is on a budget, and there's a 200 grand pay rise. And today the headline is like, the Governor-General who will care. I'll care for an extra 200 grand. I'll give everyone a hug. Just line up. So my question is, what will the tipping point be? Who's to know? Who's to know? Everything, as I said, everything that can be shaken is being shaken, and I think we should all buckle up for the ride, and more importantly, be open to important conversations that will, if we don't fight for the things we believe in, we will settle for the choices and the lifestyle and the values that other people are prepared to fight for.
So many thanks to Peter and Gemma for lively presentations. We're now going to questions and discussion. After that, you can line up for a hug from Gemma. And we'll also be conducting an auction for a Tesla. Peter can be the auctioneer. So if you two come back here. The news today, of course, was main political news was the allegation or the claim that the Lebanese Muslim Association is going to run Muslim candidates in Labor-held seats of prominent ministers like Jason Clare, Tony Burke, Chris Bowen. Now, I have a rule, as the saying goes, I never make predictions, especially about the future. But is this a real threat to Labor? Because someone would have to give preferences to that group for them to get close to Labor. These are not Teal seats, these are Labor seats. So what do you think about that? I mean, it applies particularly in New South Wales. To some extent it applies in Sydney. To some extent it applies in northern suburbs of Melbourne. How do you think that's going to work?
Go for you. Go for it.
Okay. Sure. Unless they end up deliberately preferencing against the Labor Party, like Pauline Hanson did to the Liberal Party at one point, I don't think that it will have the implications that it otherwise might. Because ultimately, there's always a bit of a bleed when you give your first preference to another party. You don't get them all back. But I think that they would get most of them back. So, and I don't, as Gerard points out, without making a prediction, I don't think they would get to a high enough threshold to therefore start taking Liberal preferences and actually seriously challenging those Labor candidates. Maybe in the odd seat, it's possible. I think more likely they could give their preferences to Labor eventually, but through a community independent, like Di Lee, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Something like that, I think, is a real problem, because they could have community independence in some of these seats that more resemble the Teals, and then thrive when Labor starts to disseminate and when, protest movements like Gerard talks about start deciding to try to break away and teach Labor a lesson. Ultimately, I think that still gets back to the prediction of a Labor minority government, but it just makes it even messier because then they're dealing with extra independence on the way through. So that would be my assumption there.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I think it's also really important to understand the context of it as well. Like it feels to me very reactionary. Sorry, it feels to me very reactionary as we're not getting what we want, so we're going to go for you. And that seems to have been okay it's this weird thing where it's only like, oh no, when it's against the left, if that makes sense. Yeah. I don't know that it's going to be particularly impacting at all outside of those, obviously outside of those seats, but I just don't have a deep enough read to sort of make an informed view. But I just look at it and think it's really, I don't know, it just doesn't sit with me.
And the other thing I was going to say is it could become a wider campaign distraction for Labor. Yeah.
Warren?
Yeah, sure. Oh, sorry. You don't want me to stand up and block your beautiful faces on the thing. As you know, I was one of the leaders of the No campaign. And it was really interesting because when we sat down in September 2022 with the pollsters told us that we'd only win Western Australia and Queensland and maybe South Australia and Tasmania, but the rest definitely not. Their vote was 70% and our vote was 30%. Within 4 months, so February that year, we totally flipped it. Now, the thing that I'm talking about, people talk about the silent majority, is when I spoke to the pollsters that day and I looked at the data, they said, so what do you think, Warren? And I said, we're going to win every state in the Northern Territory in the national vote. And they said, why do you think that? And they laughed. Actually, they did laugh. And I got the last laugh in November when I met them again. But I didn't laugh. I'm a humble person. Is the Australian community are really polarised at the moment. You've seen it in the Howard years with the Howard Battlers, where tradies and skilled workers abandoned the Labor Party. They're up in arms at the moment. And the other thing is, because just the last one is, the good question is that I'm in the mining industry, so I'm in the capital markets. We're putting people out of jobs now. And we predict post-August there were going to be a lot of people out of jobs. So the question is, I think a lot of people are missing what is happening on the ground. And I think that the Labor Party are missing as well. So how do they try and turn this around?
Okay.
How does the Labor Party try and turn it around?
And all the Libs try and take advantage of it.
Well, from my perspective, strategically, the Liberal Party should be talking about nothing else but that. Just nothing else but that. A little bit of, shilly-shally on the side, but talk about nothing else but that. I don't think the Labor Party can turn it around because it's of their making.
Yeah, and that's where I wonder whether the nuclear thing becomes a distraction that hurts the opposition because it's a little bit all over the place and a little bit uncosted and all the rest of it. Or does that not matter? Because people say, you know what, if Labor's going to spend their whole time trying to do a scare campaign, which might normally work on that issue, we don't care because we're worried about all these other issues. So that could go either way. History suggests the scare campaign works, but we are in unusual times. I mean, the Labor Party, the biggest problem I think that they've got is that on these economic issues, they're not going to get better, they're going to get worse, and yet they're going to be tempted to delay in the hope that they get better, and they don't have any apparent answers to deal with it. I just think that they scrape home because I just think that they get there because it's a first term. If we were having this discussion and this was going into a second term, I'd give the opposite prediction because I think that the sentiment that's out there is for a change of government, but I just caveat that by saying I don't think it gets there because it's a first-term government.
Thank you. I'm trying to wrap my head around the huge, significant growth in the Greens, vote at the moment. And I presume it's mainly young people who are seemingly disaffected by increasing rentals and, as you said, not the inability to buy a house. But as Warren mentioned, that as the economy is genuinely tightening at the moment, there's going to be increased unemployment, and they're the first ones to suffer. Do you think that there will be a move away from the Greens to more pragmatic parties if that occurs late in the year?
You can start.
I don't, because I think the Greens, and I don't say this admiringly, I think the Greens have been very clever, because they're not just an environmental party where you could see the end of post-materialism in an economic time that sees their votes just collapse, like what essentially happened in 93 after the high environmental vote in 1990, whether we're talking about Greens or Australian Democrats. The difference is the Greens have been very clever at finding other issues that can include tapping into people who feel like they're suffering under cost of living. So, for example, traditional Labor-leaning voters, not necessarily younger, but probably more likely younger, who are just upset that Labor isn't doing enough for them. Why haven't they put up unemployment benefits, for example, or whatever else it might be? The Greens, with all care and no responsibility, because they're not in government and probably never will be in some form, they can hold up a light for them, and they can do that on various different issues, and then people will hear what they want to hear from the Greens. So, the wealthy person living in Wentworth who doesn't like the Greens' policy for abolishing inheritance doesn't worry about that, because they hear what they're saying on the environment, and so then that's why they'll give them a vote. And also, they might not vote for them in the lower house, but it won't matter in that seat anyway, but they'll vote for them in the Senate because they can convince themselves that they voted a different way, probably in that case teal, in the lower house. So I think the Greens can survive in a way that those sort of post-materialist parties didn't once survive, because of the way that they're more than just an environmental party, but it's all about all care and no responsibility.
Well, I think the Greens are a little bit like mould. They're always there, and it's just a degree of whether they flourish, the conditions that they flourish and dissipate and flourish and dissipate. They add absolutely nothing to the Australian body politic, and I actually wrote a column last year about bringing Bob Brown back. That's how desperate I was, because back then they actually stood for something. Now they don't stand for anything. It's about what they're against, and they'd rather look at Victoria. They'd rather vulnerable people be plunged into energy poverty because they're saving the environment. Like I said, I drive an EV. I know how many kids got sent into mines that would never be allowed to operate in this country in order for me to, paint the town green with my virtue. Like, it's just, I think the problem's a communication one. I think there's two things: communication of who they are, what they stand for, and the actual outworking of their policies. But the second one is this, I don't know, like I'm trying to find the right words to wrap around it, but the generations that have come out of schools and high schools, and you can't turn around the capturing of academia. I mean, you would know that better than most, but you can't turn that around in a heartbeat. I cannot imagine, I could never have imagined, for example, a university negotiating with, terror organisations or terror sympathisers and saying, come and have a seat at our table. Like, forget the organisation regardless of who they are and what they are for or against. I think there's something fundamentally broken in a period of time that has affected a generation, and until you have to wear the consequences of that stuff yourself, like a kid going, oh my God, I'm being taxed this much, or I can't access energy, or I can't, do whatever that currency of that person may be. Does it turn around? I think it does, but I don't know that it's a short turnaround, if that makes sense.
Just a question about Labor's primary vote. It went down at the last election by about 0.75%, yet they got elected. How low can it go that they stay either in minority government or government? And secondly, Queensland notoriously swings. What do you think it will do next election? Will it swing towards Dutton being a Queenslander as well?
Well, there's not too much more that the coalition side can pick up, or the LNP as it is up in Queensland, that they can pick up, because they're so dominant up there already. It's a good result for Peter Dutton just to hold what he's got in Queensland and then go searching elsewhere, and probably maybe not entirely reverse what happened in WA, but bring a lot of that back, because they're like a mini Queensland. Okay. West Australians think that Queenslanders aren't parochial enough, so so he's doing well anyway if he holds the line in Queensland. Yeah, maybe with the odd exception to go with that. What was the first part of your question? Sorry,
it was about how low could Labor's.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I mean,
given that it was 32 and it went down by 0.75%.
Yeah, look, theoretically, it's possible for them to win as a minority government with a high 20s. Look, I suspect though if they broke below 30, they're probably finding a way to lose after one term. But yeah, they do keep going down. That's just, it comes back in preference flows. And the Greens, the surge of the Greens and the Greens' resilience outside of post-materialist issues contributes to the decline in Labor's vote at the same time as the top-up that it then gets as a result of preference flows. Just quickly on that last one, I do love the idea of the Greens on one hand getting to govern just for one term, other than the damage it would do to the government and the country. Yes. But I do.
It'd be the end of them, really, wouldn't it?
And it would also break that historical 1931 record, I suspect. But anyway.
Very true.
Just a couple of things. I'm with you on the minority government for two or maybe three reasons. Firstly, while the Liberals, while the Labor Party has a very small majority, the Liberals have got to win, is it 30 seats or something to be a government in their own right?
Yeah, not far off, because I think they're on 57.
Also, I think you can win as an unpopular opposition leader from the Conservative side, but not in the first term. Take Malcolm Fraser, take John Howard, take Tony Abbott, just for starters. They all won very handsome elections and they weren't popular. So I'm not worried about the popularity of the leader. But can you see the real problem for Labor as being this extraordinary, almost European style of a parliament where we've totally undermined the two-party system in the next government?
Yeah, well,
we have a whole disparate group of people from whom the Labor Party will have to try and govern as a minority.
Well, and in that sense, I think that history can repeat itself to what happened in 2013. Different structure of a minority government, because as you say, it would be much more disparate and there'd be all these different forces. And here's what I think is the biggest mistake that Labor would make in the aftermath of a minority government result at this election. They think that Anthony Albanese's great strength is managing the internals, which to an extent it is. I mean, the Parliament's internals from his time doing that as the Leader of the House under Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd. That might be true, but he would then try to do that as Prime Minister, which would just see his prime ministerial popularity sag, because you don't want a Prime Minister who's running around trying to be the Leader of the House. And so he would sort of co-opt that role equally with Tony Burke. And so I think that, that sort of result, I think, turns them into a two-term government. Labor people try to argue that it would be different and they can emulate states which have managed to quite successfully fall into minority government, but it's a different kettle of fish because exactly as you point out, it would be it's such a bigger parliament for a start, with so many more voices, with so much more media attention than state politics gets, and every little mistake counts. I mean, here in New South Wales, what's happened between the Nats and the Liberals is the most bizarre thing I think I've seen for a very long time. If that was going on federally, it would just be up in neon lights everywhere. But because it's state politics, you barely see it. You have to go searching for it. And that wasn't even the case in decades gone by. So, I think it causes the kind of chaos that brings Labor undone subsequently.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Three quick questions. One. Okay. In the context of, is the Teals moment over? Are the Greens going to create a Teals moment for Labor? And how much is that incoherence in the state politics going to influence the coalition, in particular, given that the LNP looks likely to lose the unlosable election in Queensland? Thank you.
I didn't hear the news about the LNP being on the nose. That's not what I understood, for starters. Secondly, I think the Teals, like I said before, there's no Scott Morrison to hate. And a big part of the Teals was about the perception that the Liberal Party is anti-women. I mean, I wouldn't want to be a woman in the Labor Party, frankly. Like, let's be really honest about it. So there's nuance to the answer. Personally, I think the Teals star is on the wane, and hopefully you were wrong about Queensland.
I don't agree with that about the Teals. I think the Teals, the best thing that happened to the Teals was not having to decide to support this Labor government as a minority government, even if we were talking about 1 or 2 seats where they could do it without the Teals, because that would at least then create the perception that they were sort of, in a sense, on board somehow. I think they got saved by being made irrelevant in this first term, which will give them the benefit of the doubt to get a second term. What becomes relevant is if I'm wrong and Dutton et al. Do well enough to have it such that the Teals on their own could make Peter Dutton Prime Minister, and they demur and don't do that, then I think they've got problems. And I think that the sort of problems that you identify in the Teals, I think that happens eventually, but I don't think it happens after one term.
No, I agree.
Now, we've only got 10 minutes left. Everyone's got to be very brief.
The long-term trend is the primary votes moving away from the major parties, and in the last election we saw many seats follow that trend. What are the seats to watch where that trend might continue? And remember, in the last election, the effect of the Teals was the Labor Party ran dead in many seats.
That's for you.
I think the key there is the strategy to run dead. Absolutely. And people forget this. People think of the Teals as winning off the back of disaffected Liberal voters. They actually get more votes from non-Liberal traditional voters in other areas that they cobble together as the main alternative to the Liberals, and then they take off sort of 15 to 20% of the Liberal vote as well, and then that gets them where they need to. So it is precarious for them with their ability to hold on if preferences go differently, but it comes back to strategy. I have, and faith is the wrong word because it sounds like I'm a paid up, signed up member of it. I believe that Andrew Hirst and the Liberal Party will be very strategic in running dead in the seats that there are community independents that might rise to be the equivalent of the Teals in Labor seats. It's just whether that happens or not. It's sort of, the Teals are almost by definition again this post-materialist phenomenon. Labor seats tend to be too material for that. And they've already got the Greens that harvest up the remainder, but they never get high enough to challenge Labor, so they just help them on their way. So I think that's the way it's going to be. But the decline in primary votes doesn't really matter as long as they're going to parties that aren't ultimately a challenger to you. They just cobble together subsequently, and they just reflect disaffection in the electorate, which then all comes back eventually because of a preferential system.
Do you have anyone?
No. Okay.
You've got to be brief.
I'd just like to know what you guys think about the quality of the coalition front bench, and could that be a swing factor?
I mean, anything can be a swing factor in this environment. As for the quality of the coalition front bench, it's no worse than the quality of the cabinet.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, it's the quality of all MPs, I think, is a problem at the moment. Not enough people that you would want to from a diverse enough background, and I don't mean that in the diversity definition of diversity. I mean employment-wise. Not enough people like that are going into politics anymore. There's so many disadvantages to it, and the party machines are becoming more insular anyway, so it's harder to get those type of candidates. So yeah, it's Tweedledum or Tweedledee for me in terms of a lack of depth on both sides.
Yes. Will the situation in the Middle East and the Greens' anti-Zionistic, anti-Semitic views attract more votes, especially from the young?
I think the people who hold those views are already voting for the Greens, personally, and the people who are holding those views in a more moderate, still, from my perspective, awful posture, are already voting for Labor. I think it's very interesting to see what people really stand for, and when you break it down, and if that atrocity had been committed against any other cohort in any other country, we'd be hearing about it in a completely different paradigm. So, like I said, the Greens are the Greens are the Greens, and people who say that's justifiable resistance are already in that cohort of voters.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that the Greens have embedded themselves now with a vote that's somewhere between 8 and 12%, fairly comfortably, which means that they win a Senate spot in every state, unless the Labor Party, which I don't see it doing, but unless the Labor Party decides to try to do to the Greens what it always says that the Liberals need to do to One Nation and vote preference against them, and then and sort of kill them off. But they couldn't do that because that would probably drive some voters for the Labor Party to the Greens rather than away from them. So, yeah, I think that they're embedded as that third force, which is a real problem in the Senate. They're not the Australian Democrats, certainly not the Australian Democrats of old.
You're getting very close to the end. Got to be brief.
Thank you. If I can just take you back to the nuclear issue, I accept your point about big risk and big issues and three-eyed fish, and good luck with the Tesla, Gemma. But if that debate is about economics and about cheaper power, and particularly in the wake of a potential interest rate rise in August, and if we're just talking about cost of power and cost of living, do your views change when it's a comparative issue between nuclear and renewables and the cost thereof of both?
Sorry, can you just repeat that? Sorry, you go.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think that it becomes that you're talking about a proper debate, and I don't think it can even be that while it's an opposition trying to promote a nuclear policy. I think it becomes a proper debate when a government does it. Yeah. So it's sort of, unfortunately, it becomes a bit of a sort of a moot point in my mind.
Yeah, and also the context, like that debate would be completely different if you and I weren't getting absolutely stung for every single thing, whether it's at the checkout or our power bills. If we were all comfortable going, life's pretty good, I wouldn't be interested in talking about nuclear. And the argument of, or maybe I would, but the argument is, oh no, that's 10 years away. Okay, well, let's stop all cancer research then, because that's 10 years away, probably more. It's a silly argument. It'll be up to the opposition to prosecute it really, really, really cleverly, in a really targeted way, and reminding people that the reason we're having this conversation is because Labor promised to bring our power bills down, but instead they've gone up by X amount %.
Yes.
I tend to think if Labor gets pinged on energy, it's irrespective of the nuclear debate, would be the way I'd put it.
Just a few final comments. The news today was about Senator Payman and her relationship with the Labor Party. It's a difficult position for the Prime Minister Albanese, whichever way he handles it. Do you think that's going to continue, or do you think that'll dissipate?
We were talking about this before. I'm just tired of hearing of her voice, and the observation. No, seriously, because she's a first-term senator from WA, politically a nobody, right? And she's made the Prime Minister look weak, and all of the things that we know. If I was going to plan this out, I think she's probably going to, stay the course and potentially cross the floor again, potentially, do something to violate the Labor caucus. She'll be turfed out of the party, and then she'll be off the Labor Senate ticket. She won't be an independent senator for WA. That's the end. That's my view.
Yeah, and we forget she was number 3 on the ticket anyway, right? So it was unusual that she got elected as number 3 in WA. But I don't agree with her on the issue that she's fighting on. But I think it's exposed how archaic the Labor rules are, that you should be kicked out of the party if you have a conscience, essentially.
Yeah, but that's the thing. You joined the party knowing the rules.
Oh, no, true. No, I'm not defending her, but she joined the party, she knew the rules, and she's in. But having said that, it has exposed it, I think, with the way that it's... the Prime Minister tried to not kick her out. He still hasn't quite kicked her out. He might have to. If this was on the Liberal side, they'd cross the floor, they'd be labelled a maverick, and they'd lose their pre-selection next time. And maybe, if they were silly, they'd decide that they're going to have no friends in Parliament and go to the crossbench before the end of the 6 years. Whereas on the Labor side, it's just exposed that tribalism's a bit old-fashioned, I think.
And I'm going to just make a little cheeky point to close with, and I've said this before, it does expose that about the Labor Party, but it also shows that there is a savage discipline, right? Like Penny Wong coming out and going, I voted against same-sex marriage for how many years because that was the position of caucus. That girl goes in the sin bin. I thought that was really interesting.
And sorry, I know, Gerard, you're going to kill us because we're over time, but the Penny Wong example that was always being used as a way of showing that she's done the right thing. I wanted same-sex marriage for years, but I wasn't prepared to stand up for it. Personally, I think that's an example of what's wrong with it. They didn't even introduce same-sex marriage. That's right. The other side of politics did. And this is something that she believed in and that she lived as a lived experience. I think that the tribalism and her playing the game is the exact opposite of what she should have done, and I think it's embarrassing to her, frankly.
It's this savage discipline. It's this savage discipline, like whatever it takes, right? Not saying it's right. I'm just saying... Sorry, Gerard, I'm going to say thank you so much.
What I'm saying is... all I was trying to say is we've got to get to the auction. That's all I was trying to say. So look, there are a lot of people here tonight. I'll be very brief. A terrific night. Great contribution from Gemma and from Peter. We'll have them back again, but for tonight, well done.